everyone and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. Today I'm here to bring you my Victober reading wrap up for 2022. So this is my first Victober. For anybody that doesn't know, Victober is a readathon which encourages people to read Victorian literature during the month of October by 5 lovely hosts who are Katie of Books and Things, Kate from Kate How, Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, Petra from Petra U, and Raz from Scallydanding About the Books. So I had a really good reading month in the month of October. I read 7 novels, 1 play, 8 short stories or novellas, and poems from 29 poets. So I really had a brilliant reading month and I'm really happy with the amount I got through. Most of what I read this month was Victorian literature, though I did read a few other things as well. So starting off, I'm going to start off with historical fiction I read that wasn't for Victober. Actually, while I was looking for something else, I found this novella called A Thief in the Night by K.J. Charles. It's a Regency novella about these two men that meet in a pub one night and they have an encounter, only for one to rob the other while they're asleep, and they meet again the next day under unexpected circumstances. So yeah, it was just such fun, and I actually don't really know what called me to pick it up. It was probably just a time period and it was included with my Audible subscription, so I said I'd pick it up and I was so glad I did. It was a great read, so light-hearted and funny, but still, like, you know, touching on serious issues in the plot, and yeah, no, it was brilliant, and I'll definitely be reading more by this author. And I already have downloaded an audiobook of one of their full-length novels as well, so yeah, I'm sure I'll be getting to that before long. So another historical fiction book I read this month was one of my priority reads for the rest of 2022, and that's The Resurrectionist by James Bradley. I had intended to read this in Halloween, but I actually read it a few days before Halloween in the course of a day while I was in Dublin. I just read it on the train and things, and it was such a good book. It's set in the 1830s, and it's about this guy called Gabriel who's apprenticed to an anatomist. So I wouldn't say that this is so much a scary book as a gory book, but it still definitely does have elements of a horror story in it. You know, it is definitely not a book for the faint-hearted. Not only is there plenty in here about dissections, but also due to the time period, he is kind of plunged into the world of like body snatching as well. And yeah, there's some seriously disturbing moments in this book, and the descriptions are so vivid. However, I will say that it was so well written and such a like gripping description of like the darker side of Georgian London. I really enjoyed it, so yeah, would highly recommend with the big provision. That definitely, if you're a bit squeamish or anything, it's not one for you, but yeah, even the cover is gorgeous. So then I suppose it's on to my Victober reads. I actually did manage to read all of my TBR, which is brilliant, and I managed to read 1 or 2 extra things as well, which is even better. So the first book I'm going to talk about isn't actually Victorian literature. It's historical fiction set in the Victorian period, and that's The Pawnbroker's Reward by Declan O'Rourke. It's set in 1846 in Ireland, down in Cork, just at the very start of the Great Irish Famine, and I really liked the time period that it focused on. So like in 1845 there was like a partial failure of the potato crop, but very few people died. And 1846 then was kind of the first really devastating failure. So this book does such a good job of just capturing people trying to come to terms with what is happening, and I think that was its strength, the number of perspectives it managed to show, from the very poorest that were digging up the potatoes and finding that they were going to rot and wondering how they were going to survive the winter, to the more merchant and wealthier classes of society that were watching this happen and, you know, knew they wouldn't be in trouble themselves, but were trying to put processes in place that you know, and make sense of things, and just the kind of layers of bureaucracy that there were that you had to try and get through. It really captured the complexities of all different types of people. There was no like caricatured villains in this. It was just, you know, some people are, you know, more out for themselves than others, and, you know, some people are opportunists, and that's just the way the humans are. But because it's such a long book, it's told over the course of months, I actually found it was a perfect book. I actually was reading this for about 3 weeks, and it was the perfect book to like read slowly and pick up and put down, and I would never forget any of the characters in here. They were all so vivid, and the writing was so beautiful. Like, Declan O'Rourke is a songwriter, so that really, I think, showed in the quality of the writing. I will say I don't think it'd be an easy book for somebody to read that wasn't familiar with Irish history, or that didn't have some familiarity with kind of the way Irish society was organised at this time, because it definitely didn't explain anything. It definitely threw you in at the deep end. I really liked it for like the realism of it, but, you know, the main character in this book is a pawnbroker. He gets people into his shop to like pawn their last few items, but also he sits on a relief committee himself, but then there's like an upper echelon of society above him, that controls the workhouse, and he sits in on those meetings as a reporter, but he's not allowed to talk. So all those meetings kind of are discussed in great detail, and the different motives of people in the town, and what they're hearing from Dublin, what they're hearing from England. So I think people might find that tedious, but I really liked it, and it really lent a sense of kind of realism to the book. I think this is definitely the best book about the Irish famine that I've ever read. Under the Hawthorn Tree will always have a special place, but this is, I suppose, a more serious adult book. And I wouldn't say that everything is tied up at the end, but I personally really liked that. It doesn't attempt to cover the whole of the famine or the whole of people's lives. It's just giving you a snapshot. And I found the ending really powerful. So I highly recommend this if you are interested. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, and well worth the length. So with that, I suppose we're into the Victorian literature proper that I read. I'm going to start with the short stories, which is Marissa's prompt, and then I'm going to go through the novels in chronological order of when they were published, and finish off then with the poetry, which was Rosa's prompt. The other 3 prompts then are covered by the novels. So I read short stories from 2 authors this month, and so the first ones I'm going to talk about are Elizabeth Gaskell. So I read 5 stories from a collection that I have on my e-reader called The Complete Elizabeth Gaskell Supernatural Stories, or something like that. And I read Disappearances, the Squire's story, The Doom of the Griffiths, the Old Nurse's story, and Lois the Witch. So I really liked most of them. Disappearances was a bit odd and disjointed, and I wasn't sure if these were real stories that were being told, or if Elizabeth Gaskell had made them up. I probably, with a bit of research, I could have found out, but I didn't. I did enjoy the others, but I think 2 that stood out for me were Lois the Witch, which kind of focuses on Lois after the death of her family has to move from England to America, where she ends up in Salem. The one thing I was a bit disappointed in this was I thought it would be better with a different title, but yeah, it was interesting to see the Salem witch trials through fiction. I haven't read any other book set in that period. And then the other one I read, which I think was my favourite, was The Doom of the Griffiths. And this was about a family who'd been cursed at some stage that, several generations down the line that they would run out because their predecessor had done something bad. And I really liked that one. So I still have several stories left in that Elizabeth Gaskell collection, and I was enjoying them. So I think I will finish that out over the rest of the year because it's just on my Kindle and it's nice to read before bed. So the other short stories I read then were 2 short stories from The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle, which I have in this big annotated edition. So I only did read 2 of them. I enjoyed them so much. So I read the first 2, which are A Scandal of Bohemia and The Red-Headed League. They were so entertaining, and I can't believe that I haven't read more Sherlock Holmes before now. I just love the setup of Watson and Sherlock, and some notes in this edition were good, so I skipped most of them because that's what put me off Sherlock Holmes for a long time, was that I tried to read all the notes in this and they were a bit overwhelming. But some of them definitely were interesting, kind of about the internal chronology of the stories and that. And there's one point where Watson is supposedly married, and then the note is that his wife wasn't being that worried about him because he stays at Sherlock's for 2 nights without sending a letter home or anything. So those kind of notes are funny, but just so brilliant, and I really enjoyed A Scandal of Bohemia was good, but The Red-Headed League was just really funny, I suppose, because I have red-headed people in my family. So I will definitely be reading more Sherlock Holmes because I enjoyed those 2 stories so much. So after that, I suppose we're into the novels. So the only novel, it was kind of strange this year that I actually ended up reading mostly novels that were set in the 1890s. I only read one that was set earlier, and I used it to fulfill 2 of the prompts. Kate's challenge to read a book with disability rep, and Katie's challenge to read a Billings roman. And this was, of course, The Fabulous Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. So I think this is probably my 3rd or 4th read of Jane Eyre, and I really enjoyed it. However, when I went back and looked at what I'd previously written about Jane Eyre in my book journal on previous readings, my opinion kind of hadn't changed at all. Although I really enjoy it, I prefer the first half a lot more than the second half. Although I like Jane and I like Mr. Rochester as individual people, I just don't really buy the romance. I suppose I'm always just, a little bit disappointed in Jane that she is so kind of attached to him, and I don't really understand the reason, but I know I'm in the minority, but I still loved it. As I said, I'm just more interested in her childhood. Like, I love her time at Lowood, especially like her as a teacher in Lowood. I wish we'd gotten like more of that. But it's undoubtedly just a brilliant book. And there are loads of lines that are so like brilliantly written. One of my main reasons for reading this is I wanted to compare it with Villette, and I would still say that I prefer Villette. But I would love if you could just take the first half of Jane Eyre and second half of Villette and just jam them together. That would be the perfect book. So, yeah. Anyways, I'm so glad to have read Jane Eyre again because it had been a while and I felt like it was a gap. So that brings us on to the adaptation that I watched to fulfill Petra's prompt. So I had initially been planning to watch the 2006 one with Ruth Wilson and Toby Stephens and maybe even the movie, but Valerie from Thornfield Books, and like with a name like that, you know she knows her stuff about Jane Eyre. She convinced me that the 1983 one with Timothy Dalton was worth watching, and I'd never seen it before, so I did, and I really liked it. As she said, like the Mr. Rochester, Timothy Dalton, he is a brilliant Mr. Rochester, and I really like Jane as well. It's nice that she is so, the actress is so like diminutive. I just thought, she was a really good Jane as well. But I suppose, as brilliant as it was and like very faithful to the book, I need to go back and watch the Ruth Wilson one. I suppose that will always kind of have just a special place in my heart, and you know, because the Timothy Dalton one is just a small bit older, it probably just isn't as like beautiful or like polished as the newer one. Yeah, but definitely I'm so glad I watched it, and definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it before. So the next book I'm going to talk about is Tess and the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, which was published in 1891. Oh my god, this is the find of Victober. Like, the overwhelming feeling I had when I finished this was, why haven't I been reading more of Thomas Hardy? Why did I prioritise joining in the group readathon of the Mary Costabry? But like, yeah, Thomas Hardy has everything I liked. It was such a gripping book. Like, pages of this book just flew by. I read it over the course of a weekend or something. Of course, the thing that everybody says about Tess and the D'Urbervilles is it's devastatingly sad. When the tragic thing at the start that I think most people know about, but I won't say it here just in case, happens. Oh yeah, that's the sad bit over. No, the sad bit was not over. The sad bits just kept on coming and coming, and poor Tess had so much travails throughout her life, and you know, the dignity she maintained throughout the book was just really made me like her a lot. So the premise of this book, really, the Tess of the title, is from quite a humble family, and one day her father is told that they're descended from these knights. The father starts giving themselves, I suppose, airs and graces, and he sends Tess to their supposed, family to try and get favours off them, basically, and the story goes on from there. As I said, Thomas Hardy is just such a good writer. He writes such complex characters, even though there are some characters, you know who they are, that are just terrible people, but other characters is just like, yeah, I wouldn't even say they're morally grey, because they're not, but like, I mean, still, there's so many layers. There were some great female characters in this. I'm thinking especially of the, some friendships that Tess has with other women, and they were just so nice to read about. And yeah, as I said, I just loved like the agricultural setting. I really loved reading about the scenes in the dairy, but like they were kind of described in this really idyllic way, because I suppose that's when Tess maybe is at her happiest, and then like, other tougher outside work she does is when she has like come down in life quite a lot. So I just loved all the details. I could recognise them in stories from like my parents and my grannies, like, how they would have milked cows and things when they were younger. So yeah, it's just, Hardy captures it all so wonderfully, and I'll definitely be reading more Thomas Hardy next year. I just can't wait to read more of his work. I really love this one. So I actually have it in with the novels, but the next thing I'm going to talk about is actually a play, and that's The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, which is published in 1895. This is about two men that are talking in one of their like London lodgings, and they both have reasons for calling themselves Earnest, and it's just so wonderfully funny and clever. I was laughing out loud at multiple points. I can't even imagine what it must be like to see it live. It must be brilliant. Just the situations they get into, and one of them in particular is just so naughty and likes causing trouble. Yeah, I'll definitely be reading more Oscar Wilde plays, and I would love to see on stage if it ever came along, so I'll be keeping my eyes peeled. But yeah, it was just such a delight. I'm really glad I read it. So the next book I'm going to talk about is this book, Bob, Son of Battle by Alfred Ollivant, which was published in 1898. And the one thing to say is this is actually the US title. The UK title is Oud Bob. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's OWD. But yeah, I like the US title better, so that's what I'm going to call it, Bob, Son of Battle. So this book is set in the sheep country of England, Cumbria. It's about this village of farmers, and in particular 2 neighbouring farmers and their sheepdogs, and the interactions of their children. For various reasons, this enmity ends up springing up between them. And yeah, there's a lot of the story revolves around this sheepdog competition and the rivalry they have over that. This book was not what I was expecting. From what I'd read and from the back cover, it was like, oh, this is like the first great dog story, or you know, I was expecting this to be a book for dog lovers. I'm not sure I would recommend this book to dog lovers. This is definitely a book in which dogs are held in very high esteem by the shepherds, but it's definitely about working dogs. And there's a lot of violence in this book between people, but especially between people and animals, between different dogs, and I suppose quite upsetting. I found there were scenes in this book with sheep which are, you know, quite reminiscent of that scene in Far From the Madding Crowd. If you know, you know. I did enjoy it on the whole. I suppose from the insight it gave into farming at that time, and like the harsh conditions they operated under. But yeah, it was definitely, as I say, a very violent book and like shocking moments at times. I think it's a reason why it was a very well loved book at the time, but it's not a beloved classic now. People can correct me, but I haven't seen it like reprinted or anything, because I don't think it would wash very well with today's audience. However, I did think it was really well written, and I did a bit of research on the author afterwards, and he had a very tragic life himself, I suppose, in that he joined the military, but he had a very bad horse riding accident, and I think he was under the care of doctors for 15 years or something, and he read this entire book while he was lying in bed. And I liked the writing style. When I did that research on the author, I looked at his other books and I found another book that I wanted to read. And actually, it's set after the Victorian period, so it's later in this list. But yeah, I really like that as well, so more on that later. So the next novel I'm going to talk about is Some Experiences of an Irish RM by Edith Sommerville and Violet Martin Ross, who are 2 Anglo-Irish authors, and this book was published in 1899. Yeah, in the whole, I really enjoyed this book. Like, there was definitely a lot of kind of Irish characters and Irish dialects that made me smile, funny situations, and again, like, plenty of laugh out loud situations. And from what I've seen of like clips of the television series and stuff, I think the television series expanded on it, but yeah, that same kind of humour, just very funny. As the main character is this man who takes up a post as the resident magistrate, and he moves into this like decrepit house and just kind of getting to know the characters that are around. There's some really good ones. Like, I loved his wife, Philippa. She was so funny, and also Flurry Knox, probably one of the more famous characters. The lines he had, just the things that came out of it, like things you'd still hear today. It's like, no, they weren't drunk, but they'd drink taken. Not very often you'd hear it today, but I've heard it once or twice. The one thing that did disappoint me in this was that it was very episodic. Like, there wasn't much of an overarching storyline, and also I suppose I should have guessed by the fact it was a book from that period and from that perspective set in Ireland. There was a lot about horses and hunts here. Not being a very horsey person myself, I would have liked a bit more variety, but like the last chapter was really, really good. It had nothing to do with horses, and it was just yeah, it was a really good chapter. So I really did like their writing, and I have another book of theirs, The Real Charlotte, on my TBR for December, so I'm looking forward to getting to that. And yeah, I definitely did enjoy this. I know there is another book, like Some More Experiences of an Irish RM. If I saw it cheap somewhere, or if I'm looking for something to read that'll be a bit of like reading on ebook, I probably will pick it up. So yeah, no, it was a fun little read to start off Victober. So the last thing I read for Victober that I'm going to talk about is I read a lot of poetry. I read poetry from over 40 poets, and I read, for most of the poets, I read like at least 2 poems. Some I only read 1, some I read more by, but yeah, I'd say on average 2. You know, because I read so much, it's not like I read every poem like in depth and, you know, studied it or anything. I kind of took the approach, I just like read them, and if I liked it, I might read it a second time. If I didn't like it, didn't matter, I just moved on. But yeah, no, it was a real adventure, so thanks to Roz for this great prompt, because I haven't read like poetry since school really, and it really let me think about what I like in poetry, and there are no surprises here. So the collection I read most of them from was this book, the New Oxford Book of Victorian Verse, edited by Christopher Ricks. It was just a really effortless way to try out loads of famous poets and lesser known ones. I discovered what I don't like in poetry, which probably knocks out a lot of poems for me, but that's fine. I seem to be quite a lazy person for my reading, so if I couldn't tell what the poem was about within 5 or 6 lines, not for me. Again, anything about classics, I don't know anything about classics. One of the poems I wanted to read was Ulysses by Tennyson, and no, I couldn't do it. I am currently reading this book, so good luck with that, I suppose. The thing I found frustrating about this book was sometimes, because it's a collection, sometimes there was only excerpts of a longer poem in it, so that was a bit annoying, because then I had to go online and try and find the poem in full so I could read it, but that's common to all collections. But in terms of what I did like then on the brighter side is, I like a good solid rhyming scheme, which most Victorian poetry seems to have, as opposed to modern poetry maybe. I love some nonsense or black humour, especially nonsense. I'd say most of the poems I picked out of my favourite were nonsense, which is fine. I like a bit of fun. And another one I really liked, maybe the opposite end of the scale, is narrative poems. So I loved poems that were little stories. What I didn't like so much, the poems that were kind of rhapsodizing about one thing or something, and also anything with the supernatural, with ghosts or fairies or anything. I just love that kind of thing. So yeah, because I read so many poems, I'm not going to go through every poem that I read, but I did pick out some favourites. Alfred Lord Tennyson, as I said, I didn't get on with his poetry hugely, apart from this one fragment called Eagle, which I just really liked, so I thought was still worthy of inclusion in here. Lewis Carroll, I've read some of his poetry before, and I really liked it, more on the nonsense end of things, but the one I read this time was Rules and Regulations, which is a really nonsense, just I don't know, funny poem. I just thought it was brilliant. Edward Lear, there wasn't that many of his poems in this collection, but I think I'll definitely seek out more, because I know he's known for his nonsense poetry. I read this poem called The New Vestments. It was so funny. It was about this man who made an outfit from really random things, and it ends up being stripped of him when he goes outside by all these different animals, so it was just so funny. Charles Kingsley, The Invitation to Tom Hughes. This is a bit different, but I think they were both poets, and it was just kind of, as I said, an invitation where he's calling on Tom Hughes to run away with him from all their responsibilities and go up to Snowdonia and live like they were when they were young, with nobody else around to bother them up in the mountains. So I just really liked that poem. Christina Rossetti wouldn't really be for me on the whole. I have to say I didn't really like any of the really big hitter poets, I have to say, but that's just because I don't appreciate poetry, and I know that I'm the more simpler poetry, I've already discussed. But I did really like Goblin Market. I know there are way deeper meanings of this poem, but if you just read it just about the goblin and the bond the sisters have, I enjoyed it for that, so that was fine. Which brings me nicely to this poet called William Allingham, who I'd never heard of before, but I think the favourite poem I read of the whole month was called The Dream. When I read it, I was that's there's something Irish about that. And then the next poem I read, it was The Fairies, and where there's mention of a girl called Bridget. I'm is this poet Irish? And he was, which is just a happy coincidence. But he was from Donegal. But The Dream, it's about this man. He wakes up and his dog is barking at something outside the window, and he opens the curtains, and it's just a parade of all the people he ever knew that have died walking past his window. And I just thought it was a really beautiful poem, not in a kind of morbid way or anything. It was just really nice. William Makepeace Thackeray, Sorrows of Werther, that was a funny poem again about a very unusual marriage. Another unusual marriage, Arthur Mudby, Postmortem. Oh, that was definitely black humour. A husband and wife were buried in a tomb in adjoining coffins next to each other, and their the interactions they have in the afterlife, which it was so funny. It was brilliant. Thomas Hardy, I liked 2 of his poems especially. The rest of them were grand, but the ones I really liked were A Wife in London, 1899, and of course the one I had chosen to read beforehand, The Darkling Thrush, which really is a beautiful poem, and I can see why I've heard of it. It's quite well known, so I'm not really very original in that. I really enjoyed it. 2 more, Ori Egerton Warburton, Past and Present. It was just kind of about the differences between him and his son in the way they return from school for Christmas. I just thought it was really nice. And finally, a longer one, Oscar Wilde, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. Really like that one. More of a longer narrative poem, and I really enjoyed it. So yes, I really enjoyed my poetry reading. I kind of have three poets that I would like seek out and read more by. Charles Kingsley, which was the one that wrote The Invitation to Tonquin's. There's only like two more of his poems in there, but I like that one so much I would seek out more. William Allingham, so I seeked out some more of his poems to read. There was a poem about evictions, and I know he has a longer narrative poem called Lawrence Bloomfield in Ireland. So who knows, I might read that for the Irish Readathon for a little bit of difference. And yes, Arthur Munby, if any of his poems are as funny as that one about that one post-mortem, I would be well happy. So yeah, like a bit disappointed that I didn't really love any of the big poets, I suppose, but still really enjoyed my poetry reading this Victober, and kind of took the fear off poetry for me. This is a good collection. I'd recommend anybody that is a bit frightened of poetry, like, don't go for like a collection of one poet. Go for a bind up, because it just lets you flit around. So the final book I'm going to talk about then is the other book that I mentioned that was written by Alfred Ollivant, who's the man that wrote Bob, Son of Battle. This book was published in 1908, so it's after the Victorian period, so it didn't count for Victober, but I actually didn't check that before I started reading it, and I just found out afterwards, but it was fine. I kind of wanted to read it straight away because of the premise, and that it was, you can probably guess, it was set in the Napoleonic Wars, so therefore it's like a historical fiction book. But it follows this 15-year-old midshipman who, on his way to join his first ship, ends up becoming embroiled in these events to try and stop a plan for Nelson to be like trapped and killed before Trafalgar. So the subtitle of the book is A Romance of the Sea, and that really covers it. It only takes place over like a few days, but like really so much happens. It's a real adventure story, and he ends up in the most like unlikely situations with these really unusual characters, but like not unusual as in like comedic, like unusual as in just really memorable characters. I thought they were great. This old soldier lives up in a house in a cliff top, and one of his companions in the house, I suppose kind of a servant, is like an old seaman that has no legs because he was obviously injured during the wars. Also this boy they call Blob, who seems to have an intellectual disability. I wouldn't say that the representation is very good, but he's not treated very cruelly or anything. Those kind of characters are just spotted throughout it. The gentleman of the title is actually the spy that is plotting against Nelson. He's a supporter of the French, among other things that I can't disclose without giving spoilers, but definitely was an interesting part of the plot. And yeah, it was just a really rollicking good adventure. Didn't slow down at all. I sped through it even though it's a long enough book. Some of the more unusual aspects of the story really show when the author ends with just one line after the end chapter. I wouldn't even call it an author's note. It's just like the end, then there's this note, one line, and it says, I will not be answering any questions on this book, which just shows the unusual turns he took and the unusual relationships that developed between characters. Yeah, like Alfred Ollivant, definitely a little bit of a fine theme of animals definitely carried over to this book a little bit as well. There wasn't any sheep in this one or dogs, but the love that some men in this book had for their horses. So yeah, he was just an interesting little find. So that's it for my Victober wrap up, as well as the few other things that I read that weren't Victober related. I'll definitely still be reading plenty more Victorian literature for the rest of the year and for next year. At least one per month. I'll be continuing that project. Thanks to everybody that watched my Victober videos. Thanks especially to the new subscribers that I've got in the last few weeks. And I suppose people that are less interested in Victorian literature, it'll be more of a return to regular programming for the last 2 months of the year. So yeah, thanks so much to the host for making it such a wonderful Victober, and I really loved seeing everybody's Victober content. I'll be looking forward to seeing everybody's wrap-ups, and yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for my next video.